Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the United Nations International Labor Organization, commonly called ILO? What is ILO doing to promote safety standards for workers around the world and also dealing with problems such as youth unemployment and human trafficking? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're taking a look at the United Nations International Labor Organization, which is a major organization that really tries to help raise labor standards around the world and deals with a myriad of other issues. My guest today is an expert on the International Labor Organization. My guest today is Ms. Jane Stewart. Ms. Jane Stewart is a former Canadian politician who was the Minister of Human Resources Development from 1999 to 2003. Ms. Stewart was first elected to Parliament in the 1993 election and was later appointed to the position of Minister of Indian Affairs. She currently is the Special Representative and Director of the International Labor Organization's Office to the United Nations in New York. Ms. Jane Stewart, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Pleasure to be here, Bill. Thanks for the invitation.
I appreciate you being with me again. ILO, we don't read enough about ILO, but you're constantly dealing with these major issues and you have just a myriad of input into what's happening around the world. Before we get into the issues, let's talk about the International Labor Organization. When was it formed? Why was it formed? What's its main mission?
Well, the International Labor Organization started in 1919, right after the First War. And at the time, there was significant unrest around the world, much of it focused in the labor market. And the League of Nations identified labor as a logical place where peace could be broadened and social justice should be considered and acted upon. And so the creation of this most unique organization started in 1919. And what really makes it most unique, Bill, is the fact that it is tripartite. So not only are members of the International Labor Organization governments from around the world, but equally so representation from workers and from employers. And this isn't like the civil society relationship here in New York at the United Nations. Workers' organizations, employers' organizations, and governments are all equal members of the organization in Geneva.
Exactly. So now by this tripartite arrangement, you have the governments that come together, you have the business community,
that's right,
the folks who are job creators, shall we say, you have the labor
the
folks,
actors of the real economy,
the unions
are there
come
with
into
government.
this. And do you find that they are really getting more and more cooperative as they go along, because they all have different interests, they all have common interests, but they have different agendas at times.
Well,
but do you find they're focusing and working on problems together?
Absolutely. There is an unbelievable experience that happens every year in Geneva called the International Labor Conference. And there will be on the agenda 1 or 2, 3 or 4 big issues in the world of work that the actors in the real economy and governments come and sit together to try and hash out in the creation of a standard or a recommendation as to how best to manage the challenges in youth employment, or to enhance entrepreneurship, or to focus on particular rights at work, security and safety in the workplace, those sorts of things, social protection, the importance of that. And it's quite an experience to see governments sitting in the room in the middle, workers and employers on either side, each debating clause by clause, presenting new ideas, but ultimately they hammer out a global agreement on these very important elements that drive the labor market, drive the world of work. And I can remember being a Minister of Human Resources, as you say, and reading one of the recommendations on human resource development. And here, in a very compact recommendation where all the things a government would need to have to think about from a policy perspective, from an engagement with workers and employers, on implementing and enhancing human resource development in the country. So it's a phenomenal place, really it is.
Exactly. And we'll get into that in just a moment. I was thinking back in some of the previous conversations we've had, and as I recall, the International Labor Organization, you mentioned, was formed in 1919.
That's right.
And the oldest agency within the UN's International Telecommunications Union, the Universal Postal Union, is second.
The unions, yeah, that's
and you're
right.
third,
And
so
then us,
you're right up there at the top of the tier.
And we're called a specialized agency. So we're quite different from the funds and programs that you might be more familiar with here in New York that are attached with the Secretariat. We actually have our own memorandum of understanding with the United Nations as a specialized agency that give us privileges here.
Well, why don't we do that? Why don't we start talking about, in general terms, about your 4 strategic pillars, and we can bring in a variety of different issues as we go through them. What is the first pillar as far as the ILO is focusing on to really improve working conditions, labor conditions, economic conditions, social conditions for millions of people around the world?
Well, I'd start first, I think, Bill, by talking about decent work. And the International Labor Organization has embraced the concept of decent work. So much so that it's not just any job that we're trying to create, but it is a decent job. And in defining decent work, we really look at 4 elements. One, is it fairly remunerated and freely chosen? Are there safeguards in the workplace that ensure safety? So the standards side of things. Is there voice? Do employees and employers have the way to communicate with one another to make sure things are improved and better? And it's that kind of construct, that decent work construct, that really propels the work that we do here and really around the world.
Exactly. And do you deal or get involved in situations in other countries around the world with things, you're talking about fair remuneration, and there's a debate, well, for example, in the United States right now, talking about the minimum wage, whether it should be raised. I think it's $7.50 an hour. Now it raises it to $10.25 or $10.50 or something like that. Some cities are doing it on their own. They're raising the minimum wage without federal input. But how important is that for countries, not just the United States, but countries all around the world, to look at this issue and to make sure the people who are working hard have, at least, as you say, this decent wage so they can live comfortably. They can have the basics. They may not be rich or anything, but they can still buy the basics and care for their families.
But the sense is, not only is that important, that there has to be a wage that makes a livelihood feasible, but in these days, when we're talking about economic challenges and the need for economic growth, it really is consumption and the ability to consume that creates growth. So when you don't have men and women earning a decent wage, they can't consume, and so you really don't have the kind of economic growth that is required to do all the kinds of things that we want to do. But, you know, you talk about minimum wage, we're talking about workers and employers and governments coming together and striking conventions, and there is a convention on minimum wages and how best to utilize them and what the pros and cons are and how to think about developing policy that is appropriate for your national context. So this is a particularly interesting element right now in the context of looking at inclusive growth. And it's not just any job, it's a decent job. And it's not just any growth, but it's inclusive growth where everyone can see a benefit from economic development.
Exactly. And it seems, this is another debate that's going on, I won't pick on the United States, but it just happens. I've read a bit about what's going on here, but another debate is too, rather than give tax cuts to rich people who already have an immense amount of money and could create jobs if they wanted to, you give the money, or some money, not all of it, but some money to people in the middle and lower economic classes or sections so that they have that purchasing power, because that's what creates jobs. When a company, they create jobs when they're consumers, when the customers who want to buy their products, and they're not waiting for the money just to automatically transform a company to create jobs. But you have to have that demand, do you not?
You do, and you're also getting at something that it really is one of the 4 pillars of decent work, which is social protection. And we know that in strong societies, there need to be elements of social protection right through the life cycle. So child benefits, when parents need some support to make sure their children are healthy and they have access to the things that they need to be healthy from a nutrition perspective, from a medical perspective. Healthcare, universal healthcare, and having the benefits of being strong and healthy, and then obviously better able to contribute in the labor market and to your own well-being. Employment insurance, unemployment insurance. So when, through no fault of your own, there is some cushion there to help you bounce back into the labor market and not get lost or be disattached from the labor market for too long a period of time. Or pensions. We all, although we'd like to think that we can work right through till our dying days, and many do, having access to a solid pension, something that you contribute to but is also a social contribution, is a healthy part of a good working labor market.
Exactly. And if our viewers would like more information on what we're talking about today, they can go to www.ilo.org and get much more information about the programs and projects that you're working on. You talk about the social protection, and that is so critical. Do you find that there's more receptivity today? I know many governments are cutting their budgets. So really they're going through this austerity plan, and some economists will argue that's one of the reasons that the global economy has not bounced back as quickly, is because a lot of governments are cutting and they're phasing out programs, and you're just not distributing the money to the private sector and to other people. But how important is that for us to look at that and to invest in the people and in these programs to make sure that they have this safety net and that you can spur the economy and ignite it and cause it to be more robust?
There really is a role for governments to play when the economy is in its trough. And one of the ways of doing that is through social protection. We call it an automatic stabilizer, that when times are difficult, with programs that are and have been put in place and aren't just safety nets that come in and go out, but are there that can be relied on. It creates an automatic stabilization when the economy is unable to support us through our own contributions. It's interesting, in the discussions associated with the new Sustainable Development Agenda, social protection and social protection floors are recognized as something critical to poverty eradication, as well as to sustainable development.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. Today we're taking a look at the United Nations International Labor Organization and the role it plays in helping to really raise labor standards around the world to deal with youth unemployment and many other issues. My guest today is an expert on the ILO. My guest today is Ms. Jane Stewart. Ms. Jane Stewart is the Special Representative and Director of the International Labor Organization's Office to the United Nations. We're talking about these issues, and these are so important, and they're really applicable in, I won't say every country, but probably every country around the world, all 193 countries in the United Nations, the members of the General Assembly. Let's talk a little bit about youth unemployment. I mentioned that in the opening, and this is a problem. It's a major problem in a large number of countries. I won't try to identify them. What are you folks doing? I know you work with other agencies. It's not just ILO by itself, but what are you doing, and what can we do to focus on youth unemployment to try to provide decent employment? Well, first off, training, and then decent employment for these youth.
This is such an important point for us today, because there are 73 million young men and women who are unemployed. There are significant numbers who are working but in very unproductive endeavors. There is no social protection, so they have to manage to support themselves and very often their families, particularly in developing countries. And targeting the issues, the specific issues that young people have in the labor market, is a priority for the UN and for really the world. In doing so, we have to recognize that the requirements for job creation generally positively can impact the opportunities for young men and women. So looking at macroeconomic policies, and making sure it's not only about fiscal management and about inflation control, but also about the generation of jobs. You've heard about, the growth without jobs, and that's something we're struggling with now, and that particularly is impacting young men and women around the world. But there are specific needs associated with being a young man or woman making the transition from school to work. No experience, no job, no job, no experience. That cyclical vortex that can catch a young person, particularly in these days and age. The need, again, you're the first in and the last out. The challenge associated with having training that is responsive and tied to the labor market. And that's particularly where programs like apprenticeship and engaging employers and workers, the tripartite partnership amongst governments, workers, and employers to identify what kind of education, skills, and development should be in vogue to ensure that young people can naturally move into the rapidly changing labor market. These are the kinds of things, Bill, that we have to turn our attention to and recognize that while generating employment writ large is good for improving the outcomes of young people, there are specificities that they face that we need to attend to.
And I guess the ideal situation would be for the private sector to create the jobs, but in many cases they can't create enough jobs. What role can government play as far as, first off, helping to train young people, but secondly, to create meaningful jobs, maybe with infrastructure development or something like that, rebuilding bridges and roads that are really in horrible shape in many countries around the world, but the government has a key role to play, does it not?
In difficult times, there is an expectation that the people, the government, can help enthuse the economic growth elements that are required to generate employment. But at the same time, there are things that need to be done all the time. The provision of education that makes sense in the labor market, the encouragement of entrepreneurship, for example, and creating a culture of entrepreneurship and the ability to appreciate and understand risk. The challenges of ensuring that there is effective financing available for those that want to generate and create jobs. Effective capacity to start a business, improve a business, grow a business. These are kind of policy constructs that a government can develop along with social partners, workers and employers, that ensure a healthy marketplace, a healthy labor force, and the ability of men and women to create their own opportunities and to employ others.
Exactly. Three terms we've heard a lot about lately, and we will in the future, I'm sure: migration, the forced labor, and human trafficking. How do you view those three issues? Are they in silos, or is there a continuum? Is there a linkage amongst the three? And how do we deal with those problems?
There's definitely a linkage. We know today there are 232 million men, women, and children who are migrants, either internal or across border. We know that 21 million men, women, and children are in forced labor today. 44% of those have migrated, and in some cases are much more vulnerable or susceptible to illegal activities or to be enticed into forced labor. They may be subject to trafficking, again, because of economic vulnerabilities. And let's face it, many people do move for economic purposes, a significant number, in fact. And so there is a linkage, there is a continuum there. Most recently at the International Labour Organization, I was telling you about our conference every year, the tripartite membership passed a new protocol associated with forced labor. We had a standard that was agreed back in 1930, and it's this many years later that there was a recognition that we had to modernize our understanding and reflect the new reality associated with forced labor. And so added to the responsibilities that countries have and employers and workers are things like prevention of forced labor. So to do that, making sure that there is some advocacy and understanding of the fact that it exists and how it can exist, dealing with information exchange and recruitment practices and that sort of thing. So focusing on prevention. but also protection. In the past, we thought of people who had been drawn into forced labor not as victims, but sometimes as perpetrators themselves. And now there's an understanding these are victims, and they have to be protected when they've been co-opted or coerced or in other, nefarious ways brought into illegal practices. And then also we've understood that there needs to be remedies. That after the fact, the access to compensation and to other remedies, if you have been a victim of forced labor, is now a piece of this protocol. So it's, I think, a reflection on the International Labor Organization that despite being around since 1919, it continues to keep itself current and responsive to the changing dynamics and issues associated with the world of work.
Exactly. And when there are fewer opportunities in countries and economic downturns, that would exacerbate this problem and make it even more of a challenge to try to deal with it.
This is so important, dealing with the root causes in terms of prevention, understanding the economic realities in an individual's life, and trying on a more global level to improve things for them at home with national governments, employers and workers, and make it less a necessity. So if someone chooses to move, it's because they want to move, not because they need to move. And that brings us back to, the basic importance of focusing on the generation of decent work and good economic growth that's inclusive at the national level.
And these are all difficult issues. They're not easily resolved. And probably one of the most difficult we're dealing with now is climate change. And we see the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that was appointed by the United Nations in 1988, I believe it was, has come up with their 5th report. They say that they think 95% of the carbon footprint is caused by humans. We see the seas are rising, the glaciers are melting, desertification is taking place. When you bring the governments, labor, and the businesses together, how do they deal with this problem? I know probably on one side you have the labor and businesses who maybe are more aligned on this particular issue than on some others, but how are they working on dealing with this problem, and how do you get around the fact that they may perhaps disagree on some elements of climate change?
Well, in a multifaceted approach, actually recognizing first and foremost that the green economy is presenting all kinds of new opportunities for job creation. And we appreciate that there will be winners and losers as the brown economy has to go by the boards and we transition into a lower carbon set of sectoral strategies. But our research and our reflections suggest to us that the green economy is a huge opportunity for more jobs to be created than for jobs to be lost. In the transition, and this brings us back to the importance of social protection bill, there has to be some kind of protection for those that are the losers as they transition into the new opportunities. And that's where unemployment insurance, for example, becomes so important, or pensions that can ensure a resilience and an ability to transition from one reality to another. Social protection, as we say, is that set of programs that is there to protect workers when, through no fault of their own, their jobs are gone, their skills are outdated, whatever. It's those kinds of practices and programs, active labor market measures that help people go back to school and get new training or learn how to adapt their skill set and their capacities to the new economy, or start a new business in the green economy and grow that business. So these are the kinds of discussions that we are having at the International Labor Organization, and recognize absolutely there's a role for our organization to play as the world transitions through to a greener economy in response to climate change and so many other things.
Well, in our last 30 seconds, of all the issues we talked about today, what do you think is the #1 challenge we'll be dealing with in the future?
Oh my goodness, there are going to be
hardest question right at the last.
There are going to be so many. But I think fundamentally, I'd take it right back to 1919, and it's ensuring that there's social justice in the labor market, that labor is not considered a commodity, that there is a respect for the fact that men and women want to contribute to their own well-being and the well-being of their family, and to do that, They all really just want a fair chance at a decent job.
Exactly, and these are all so important issues we need to learn more about, and people can go to www.ilo.org. But Ms. Jane Stewart, the Director of the International Labor Organization's office in New York at the United Nations, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Pleasure, Bill.
Thank you. I am Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.